What if I told you that one of England's most hated kings? Yes, that king from the Robin Hood tales, the one no monarch has dared name their son after for more than 800 years, didn't die in battle, didn't die a hero, didn't even die with dignity. Instead, his final hours were spent writhing in filth, his body convulsing in fevered spasms, his organs imploding in what one witness described as an explosion from within. There were no crowds mourning him, nor armies to defend him, no priest at his side with last rites, only the rancid stench of rot, the sound of wet fabric soaked with blood and bile, and the flicker of torchlight casting shadows on the cold stone walls of Newark Castle. This was the death of King John Lackland, the youngest son of Henry II, the brother of Richard, the Lionheart, and the man who, despite a reign soaked in cruelty, paranoia, and betrayal, would inadvertently give the world a gift greater than any crown, the Magna Carta. To understand why John's death mattered so much, we have to start with this moment, not with his childhood, not even with his crimes, but with his final breath. Because in that moment of collapse, in that gruesome, bodily undoing of a tyrant, history cracked open. It wasn't the king's life that shaped the future, it was his fall. And make no mistake, it was a fall of Shakespearean proportions. This was a king whose every decision seemed to scream insecurity, whose hunger for control devoured alliances, faith, and even bloodkin. And yet, when all was said and done, it wasn't the wars he started, the taxes he levied, or the castles he lost that would define him. It was the way he died, not as a lion, but as a shadow of a man, wasting away in his own stench, body broken by dysentery, soul tormented by failure, mind haunted by enemies, both real and imagined. And somehow, from that wreckage, emerged a document that would ignite revolutions, anchor democracies, and outlive every king who came after him. Picture the scene, October of the year 1216, and the kingdom is fractured beyond recognition. Civil war rages. The church has excommunicated the monarch. The barons, noble lords of the land, have turned against their king. Even worse, a French prince, Louis, has landed on English soil and is preparing to seize the throne. The people are starving. The treasury is empty. The crown jewels symbols of England's royal might have just been swallowed whole by the sea after a disastrous crossing at the Wash. And John, the man who called himself king, is on the run, feverish, hollow-eyed, and barely clinging to life. Every jolt of the litter, carrying his body across the ravaged countryside, sends waves of pain through his abdomen. Every breath burns. Every hour is a countdown to something darker. But it didn't start this way. John was born into greatness, or at least the illusion of it. The son of a powerful dynasty, he watched his brothers carve out kingdoms and command armies, while he lingered in the background. Bitter, overlooked, and slowly consumed by a hunger for power. And when power finally came after the death of his brother Richard, it was as if he had no idea what to do with it. His reign was not built on justice, or vision, or strength. It was built on fear. Fear of losing land, fear of betrayal, fear of being seen as weak. And in that fear, John turned on everyone. He taxed his people to the bone. He kidnapped the children of his enemies. He may have even murdered his own nephew to eliminate a rival claim to the throne. He fought the Pope. He raged against his barons. He saw loyalty as a weapon to be broken and mercy as a sign of failure. But tyrants, no matter how tightly they gripped the crown, always fall. And John fell harder than most. What makes this story so captivating isn't just the downfall of a king, It's the poetic justice of it all, that a man who drained his people, defied his church, and spat on every code of nobility should be undone, not by sword or poison, but by his own guts, by a sickness so brutal that it turned his last days into a waking nightmare, is something that feels almost mythic in scale. Chroniclers described it without mercy. They said he was reduced to moaning, sweating, twitching his bowels, emptying uncontrollably, his skin grey, his eyes glazed with fear. And as his attendants tried to soothe him, they were forced to wrap cloth over their noses, not to protect against disease, but to endure the smell of their king's disintegration. And yet, in the final hours, something shifted. John, broken and delirious, summoned enough strength to dictate a will. He named his son Henry, just 9 years old, as his heir. He begged forgiveness. He clutched at salvation, with the desperation of a man who knew he would be remembered not for love or honour, but for loss. And when he finally died on the night of October 18th, he died alone. Yes, there were guards, servants, and scribes around him. But the truth is, John died with no legacy but infamy, no victory but failure, no empire but ash. And yet, the moment he left this world, the kingdom began to heal. Because with the tyrant gone, there was room for hope. William Marshall, England's greatest knight, stepped forward. He took the young boy king and placed a crown on his head. And then he did something extraordinary. He reissued the Magna Carta, not as a broken treaty forced upon a despot, but as a foundational promise to the realm, a promise that no king, no matter how powerful, would ever again stand above the law. That's why this story matters. That's why we still speak of John Lackland more than 800 years later. Not because he was great, but because he wasn't. Because his failures, his greed, his brutality, and yes, his grotesque death became the spark for something bigger. And that is the cruel, ironic miracle of it all. The king who lost everything gave the world something it could never lose. Long before the rot reached his body, before the crown slipped into the sea, before the rebellion and the charter and the final, festering days at Newark Castle, John Lackland was already lost, not yet to history, but to fate itself, for, in a royal family built on conquest and calculation, he arrived not as a lion, nor a chosen heir, but as a mistake that needed managing, the fourth and youngest son of a king who had already divided his kingdom among the stronger, louder, and more promising sons who came before. He was born in the year 1166, into the stormy court of Henry II of England, a monarch whose intellect was as sharp as his temper, and whose bloodline stitched together the scattered territories of England, Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine into a patchwork empire that stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. But for all his ambition, Henry knew that empire was fragile, and he sought to control it, the only way he understood, by carving it up like a chessboard and assigning pieces to his sons, hoping their loyalty would be bought with land, yet dooming them all to envy and war. To Henry the young king, he gave England itself in title, though not in power. To Richard, the warrior prince, he gave Aquitaine. To Geoffrey, the schemer, went Brittany. And to John, the baby, the child born last, there was nothing left. No duchy, nor crown, no inheritance, just the cruel nickname that history would never let him forget: John Lackland. It was not merely a title of circumstance, but a curse etched into his destiny, a constant reminder that he was an afterthought, a spare with no place at the table, a prince who would spend his entire life clawing at shadows cast by the men around him. Desperate to matter, desperate to rule, desperate to not be the footnote that his father's laughter had made him feel like from the moment of his birth. But lack breeds hunger, and hunger makes men dangerous. As a child, John was sent to be educated by churchmen, a tactical move meant to prepare him for a clerical life, or perhaps a secondary post far from the throne. Yet even in youth he displayed the cunning of a predator, a mind quick with suspicion, calculation, and cold ambition traits that may have gone unnoticed were it not for the constant turmoil that fractured the Plantagenet house from within. For Henry II's sons were not content with gifts, they wanted power outright, and civil war between father and sons became as predictable as spring rain, with John watching from the sidelines, absorbing every betrayal, every shift of loyalty, every false kiss between brothers. When Geoffrey died in a tournament accident and Henry the young king succumbed to illness, only Richard and John remained. And suddenly, the boy with no land found himself one breath closer to a throne he was never meant to touch. His father, still wary of trusting him, gifted him Ireland not as a kingdom, but as a test, and John failed it spectacularly. Sent to rule in his early 20s, John arrived in Ireland with arrogance and contempt, mocking the local chieftains, squabbling with Anglo-Norman lords, and humiliating himself by alienating every possible ally. It was said that he pulled the beards of Gaelic nobles in court, laughed at their customs, and squandered funds on petty luxury. Within months, the expedition collapsed. John returned to England, not as a prince in command, but as a laughingstock, a spoiled child in noble robes, dismissed by the very men he hoped to rule. But opportunity, like history, is rarely linear. In the year 1189, Richard ascended the throne after Henry's death, becoming Richard I, later lionized as Richard the Lionheart, a king of legend. Though absent from England for nearly his entire reign, he embarked on the Third Crusade almost immediately, leaving the realm in the care of others. And here, at last, John saw his opening not as a loyal brother keeping the kingdom safe, but as an opportunist sharpening his knife in the dark. While Richard battled in the Holy Land, John schemed at home. He spread rumors of his brother's death, tried to buy influence from corrupt barons, and even attempted to have himself crowned in Richard's place. When Richard was captured in Austria and held for ransom, John did not lift a finger to help. On the contrary, he worked behind the scenes to ensure his brother stayed locked away, going so far as to offer bribes to keep him imprisoned. And yet, when Richard returned in triumph, after securing his release, he did not execute John for treason. He forgave him publicly, at least, and restored him to favour, though the stain of betrayal would never wash clean. John had tasted proximity to power and could no longer imagine a life without it. And when Richard died in 1199, struck by a crossbow while besieging a castle in France, John, despite lacking the military reputation, the diplomatic tact, or the nobility of spirit that defined his brother, declared himself King of England, seizing the crown not as a rightful heir, but as a man who saw no one left to stop him. But legitimacy, once stolen, is always questioned. The French lords who supported Arthur of Brittany, John's young nephew and a rival claimant to the throne, rejected John's coronation. And thus began the slow unravelling of a reign built on lies. John captured Arthur soon after. Imprisoning the boy in Rouen, the child never emerged again. Some say he was murdered by John's own hand. Others whisper he was drowned in the Seine. No body was ever found. But the message was clear. John was now king, and mercy had no place in his court. And so began a rule defined by loss. John lost Normandy, the jewel of the Plantagenet crown. He lost Anjou, Maine, and Poitou, lands his father and brothers had spent decades securing. Unlike Richard, John was no warrior. He was mocked by the French as Jean sans terre, the same name in a different tongue, the same insult following him like a shadow. He taxed England to pay for his failures, alienated the church with his arrogance, and ruled with paranoia so consuming that even his own supporters began to peel away, inch by inch. It is here that John's spiral into tyranny truly begins, not as an explosion, but as a slow, rotting collapse from within. Like a man dying of a sickness he cannot name, he began turning on his own people, fining the barons for imagined crimes, taking their children as hostages, extorting them into submission. And when one noble woman, Matilda de Braose, dared speak the unspeakable truth, that he may have murdered his nephew, John imprisoned her and her son in a dungeon without food, watching them die in starvation, one consuming the other in madness, before death finally took them both. The chroniclers who recorded these events did so with a mix of horror and grim fascination, as if they could scarcely believe a king born of such lineage could fall so far. But the truth, stark and unyielding, was this: John was not made for power. He was made by the absence of it. Every moment of his life had been defined by what he lacked: land, love, respect, grace. And when power came to him at last, he wielded it not with vision, but with vengeance. And what he could not earn, he would steal. What he could not build, he would break. What he could not control, he would crush. This was the boy born last, the prince with no title, the son who learned from the start that love was a currency and legacy was a battleground. He was shaped not by greatness, but by rejection, and in the shadows of kings greater than him, he nurtured bitterness, like a wound he could never stop scratching. It was not the absence of land that defined him, it was the hunger that absence left behind. And that hunger, unchecked, would burn everything. When John Lackland finally secured the crown, he had spent a lifetime scheming to possess. It was not with the thunder of applause nor the solemn blessing of divine right, but with suspicion in every corner of his court, blood still warm on the hands of his messengers, and whispers rising like smoke from the ashes of those he had betrayed to get there. For the throne of England in the year 1199 was not so much inherited as taken seized by a man who had never known how to build, only how to grasp, who had not been raised to rule, but had grown up watching power slip through his fingers like sand, and swore that if he ever caught it, he would squeeze until even the stone bled. John's first years as king were marked not by vision or statesmanship, but by desperation, an almost animal panic to hold on to what he had stolen, to secure his reign not by inspiring loyalty, but by suffocating dissent. And so the pattern was set. Instead of healing the wounds left by his brother's death and the suspicious vanishing of young Arthur of Brittany, he widened them with ruthless abandon, declaring any hesitation a threat, any hesitation a betrayal, and treating England not as a kingdom to steward, but as a reservoir to drain. Beginning with the lifeblood of its nobility, war loomed over his every decision. For even as John wrapped himself in ermine robes and sat beneath a golden canopy, the cracks beneath his throne were already spreading Philip II of France. A ruler far more cunning than John had declared Arthur of Brittany the rightful heir, and used the boy's disappearance as a justification to invade the Plantagenet holdings on the continent. And in the year 1204, after a series of blunders, retreats, and poorly led campaigns, John lost Normandy, the ancestral heart of his family's empire, and with it, Anjou, Maine, and Poitou, lands his father Henry II had spent decades securing, were gone in what felt like a blink. The humiliation was unprecedented, and with it came the reckoning, not only from abroad, but from within, for the barons of England, many of whom held titles and estates in both France and England, now found themselves exposed, diminished, and angry, not at the king who had tried and failed, but at the king who had lied and lost. And John, instead of apologizing, blamed them all, accused them of cowardice, of disloyalty, of secret correspondence with the enemy, and then he taxed them, and taxed them, and taxed them again. In the 17 years of his reign, John levied scutage, a payment that allowed barons to avoid military service 11 times, more than his 3 immediate predecessors combined, and each time the price rose, not to fund a necessary war or public works, but to patch the holes in a ship he had already sunk. And when money was not enough, he turned to extortion, demanding impossible sums from noble families in exchange for rights they already owned, threatening to seize lands, arrestons, or worse, take their children as hostages, a practice he did not invent, but which under his rule became not a tool of last resort, but standard policy. What made John's tyranny unique was not just its cruelty, but its pettiness. He did not seek to command respect, only obedience. And if he could not have that, he would settle for fear, fear so absolute that no noble dared speak freely. No churchman dared defy him, and even common merchants found themselves crushed under taxes on trade, property, inheritance, and anything else that moved, breathed, or belonged to someone he didn't like. And yet even that was not enough. For paranoia had rooted itself deep in John's mind, and wherever he looked, he saw enemies even in the eyes of children. The story of Matilda de Braose would come to define this era of John's rule, not because it was his most brutal act, but because it was the moment when the mask fully slipped, when even the most jaded barons began to whisper that their king was not merely unjust, but inhuman. Her husband, William de Braose, had once been one of John's trusted retainers, granted lands and honours for his service. But when a debt dispute arose and Matilda publicly accused John of having murdered his nephew Arthur, the boy whose disappearance still cast a long shadow, John responded not with rebuttal, but revenge, seizing Matilda and her eldest son, locking them in a dungeon at Windsor Castle, and giving them no food, save a handful of raw bacon and a single sheath of oats. 11 days later, when the cell was opened, the guards recoiled. The chroniclers who recorded the event wrote that Matilda had gone mad with hunger, and in the final hours, gnawed the cheeks of her dead child before dying beside him. And whether that detail was true or embellished, the message was unmistakable. No one was safe. Not even women. Not even children. Not even the powerful. And yet John was not finished. His wrath soon turned toward the church, where he met his match in Pope Innocent III, a man as ruthless as he was holy. And when a dispute arose over the appointment of the new Archbishop of Canterbury, John wanted a puppet. The Pope wanted Stephen Langton. John refused to accept the decision, seized church property, and expelled the clergy from their lands, prompting the Pope, in the year 1208, to place England under interdict. From that moment forward, the kingdom was spiritually cut off from Christendom. The church bells fell silent. The cathedrals closed. No weddings were performed. No masses held. No one was buried in consecrated ground. It was as if God himself had turned his face away from England. And still John did not yield. Instead, he doubled down, pressing the church for money, squeezing his bishops as he did his barons, until in the year 1209, Innocent III excommunicated him personally, declaring him unfit to rule and damned in the eyes of heaven. Now, John was not only reviled on earth, but rejected by heaven. For 6 long years, the English people lived in a kind of holy limbo, their sacraments denied, their king cursed, their future uncertain. And yet, even as famine crept into the countryside and civil unrest simmered beneath the surface, John remained unmoved, confident in his spies, his castles, and his gold. But gold cannot buy love, and when the barons finally rose against him in open rebellion, it was not sudden, but inevitable, the culmination of more than a decade of insult, humiliation, and raw fear. And when they marched on London, in the spring of 1215, John found himself almost entirely abandoned. His army had dwindled, his friends had vanished, his people no longer called him king. Cornered, stripped of leverage, and desperate to avoid outright collapse, John agreed to meet the barons at a meadow called Runnymede, beside the River Thames, and there, on the 15th of June, he placed his seal upon a document unlike any other Magna Carta. But that is a tale for another time. This chapter is not about redemption. It is about the reign that necessitated rebellion. It is about a man so terrified of weakness that he became monstrous. A king who built nothing, loved nothing, trusted no one, and ruled with such venom that even those who had once sworn eternal loyalty began to pray for his downfall. This was John at the height of his power, not admired, not respected, but feared and hated in equal measure, a tyrant in every sense of the word. But his reckoning was near, and what he thought he could destroy would outlive him by centuries. By the time the papal bull reached the English court, declaring that John, King of England, Lord of Ireland, Duke of Normandy, and Count of Anjou was officially and eternally excommunicated from the Church, it did not fall like lightning from a clear sky, but rather as the final, thudding blow of a hammer that had been striking the same spot for years, slowly cracking the stone of his legitimacy, until, at last, it crumbled entirely. For when Pope Innocent III excommunicated John in the year 1209, he was not merely condemning the man's soul, he was revoking the divine foundation of his reign, severing the fragile thread between crown and heaven, and leaving the king not just hated by his people, but damned by God himself. And yet John, in the full arrogance of his delusion, did not yield. He responded with more seizures, more punishments, more taxation, as if the wrath of God could be treated like a rebellious baron silenced, bought off, or crushed into compliance. So he sent troops to plunder church lands, harassed the clergy, looted the monasteries, and dared the heavens to strike him down. But God, it seemed, was patient. The people, however, were not. Across England, unease fermented into fury, for without the sacraments, life became a daily act of spiritual uncertainty. The dead were buried in unconsecrated ground. Couples could not marry. Babies could not be baptized. And the air itself felt heavy with divine absence. Fields went untilled. Livestock died without blessing. And storms ravaged the crops, while priests stood powerless behind locked cathedral doors. And through it all, John sat in his fortress, counting coins and sharpening suspicion, convinced that if he hoarded enough gold, he could bribe back the favor of heaven. But no one can bribe silence. And silence, in time, becomes mutiny. By the year 1215, the entire kingdom had soured against him, not merely the nobles who once toasted his coronation, but the clergy, the merchants, the common peasants, who now saw in their king not a protector, but a curse walking on two legs. And at the center of this collapsing kingdom stood a man who still believed himself invincible, still called himself sovereign, still barked orders into empty halls and expected miracles from men who no longer believed in him. It was then, in this state of complete isolation, that John made the gravest mistake of all, not in battle, nor politics, but in philosophy, for instead of seeking reconciliation, he sought control. Instead of asking for peace, he bought war, and the price was everything. Pressed by the growing threat of baronial rebellion, John attempted to outmaneuver his enemies, the way a gambler bets with borrowed money, desperate, erratic, and doomed from the first coin thrown. So he reached out to his old adversary, Pope Innocent III, and in a move so brazen that even his enemies were stunned, he surrendered the entire kingdom of England to the Pope, offering it up not as an equal but as a vassal. A petty thief begging to be protected by the man who had once cast him into outer darkness. The Pope, shrewd and always hungry for more authority, accepted the offer. In the year 1215, John became a vassal of the papacy. England became a papal fief. And John, once the self-proclaimed absolute monarch, became the Pope's man. Protected by Rome, yes, but at the cost of his sovereignty, his pride, and what little remained of his reputation among the barons who now saw their king grovelling at the feet of a foreign priest. It was the final straw. The barons, many of them hardened warriors of crusades and civil wars past, no longer saw a king when they looked at John. They saw a coward, a traitor, a man who would sell his own crown rather than admit a mistake. And so they rose. They gathered their armies, sharpened their blades, and rode for London, declaring John unfit to rule, breaking their oaths not in rebellion but in self-preservation. And when they reached the gates of the capital, the people opened them gladly. London fell without a fight. The royal court scattered. John, abandoned by almost every loyal noble, retreated into panic and rage, pacing the halls of Windsor and Winchester, scribbling orders that no one obeyed, preparing for a war that had already begun without him. For the barons were no longer seeking negotiation. They wanted blood, justice, and a document that would shackle this tyrant forever. On the 15th of June, in the meadow called Runnymede, John was forced to sit across from the men he had once extorted, insulted, and imprisoned, and for the first time in his reign, he had no leverage, no gold, no allies, no pope, no army, only a seal. They presented him with a parchment, 63 clauses of demands, a charter not of rights for all men, but of protections for the few who could afford armor and land. Yet within its ink lay seeds far more powerful than any of them understood. John signed it. He sealed it. But he never believed it. To him, it was a delay, a temporary surrender, a trick to buy time and gather strength. For in his mind, the king could never be bound, and promises made under duress were not promises at all. As soon as the ink dried, he wrote to Pope Innocent III, begging him to void the charter. The Pope, unwilling to see his vassal humiliated, complied. He declared Magna Carta null and void, a document not only shameful and demeaning, but illegal and unjust. The king tore it apart. The barons, seeing the betrayal, drew swords, and war began. It was known as the First Barons' War, and it would be unlike any conflict England had yet endured. For this time, the enemy was not a foreign invader or a rebellious duchy. It was the king himself, fighting against the very men he had once ruled, now risen in fury. And when the barons found themselves lacking a true leader, someone with royal blood, they turned not to an Englishman, but to the enemy across the Channel, Prince Louis of France, son of Philip II, heir to the Capetian throne. They invited him to take the crown of England. In May of the year 1216, Louis landed on English shores, and John, king in name only, now stood against his own people, his own church. And now, the future king of France, a usurper to some, a saviour to others, and for John a nightmare closing in from every side. The kingdom was no longer collapsing. It had collapsed, and the man at the centre had nowhere left to run. But still, he ran, across the marshes, through the estuaries, dragging behind him the last remnants of power, chased not only by armies, but by the ghosts of everything he had broken: his throne, his people, his church, his name, and soon his body. It happened not with swords or fire or shouts of rebellion, but with the quiet, creeping certainty of the tide, a force that cannot be bargained with, cannot be bribed, cannot be intimidated, rising inch by inch, to meet the arrogance of a king who believed that even the sea itself would obey his will. And in that shallow estuary known as the Wash, where the land shifts beneath your feet and the water comes faster than the wind can whisper, John of England, Lord of Ireland, once styled Duke of Normandy, watched the last symbols of his reign vanish forever into the mud. October of the year 1216. John was fleeing again. The boy he had named as his heir was still in hiding. The French prince was marching toward London. The barons no longer spoke his name without venom. And the land itself, so long battered by war, taxes, and divine silence had turned against him, cold and unwelcoming beneath his boots, unsteady beneath his wheels, and cursed in every village he passed. But John, stubborn even in defeat, still clutched at control. He refused to surrender his kingdom, refused to face the rebellion head-on, refused to see that the realm no longer had a place for him. Instead, he moved north, desperate to reach Lincolnshire, hoping to regroup with the last of his forces and perhaps, in some corner of his mind, to begin again. But in his retreat, he made one fatal miscalculation. He sent his army ahead, and behind him, he left the most precious part of his entire reign, the royal baggage train. It was not merely clothing and rations. It carried the treasury of the crown gold scraped from the flesh of a nation taxed to the bone, silver taken from monasteries stripped bare, jewels pried from the fingers of dead queens and broken loyalty, and in its gilded wagons rode the crown jewels of England themselves, including, it was said, the ancient coronation regalia once belonging to Alfred the Great. They chose to cross the Wash, a shortcut, a dangerous one, known even then for its treacherous terrain, its shifting sands, and its deadly tide that comes not slowly but all at once, like a beast waking from stillness. And John, already across, watched from the far bank. He had made it. The tide had held for him, but behind him, the sea was changing. The baggage train moved slowly, too slowly. The wagons heavy with treasure, the oxen burdened by centuries of stolen wealth, the soldiers tired, their boots sinking with each step into the softening ground. And then, the tide turned, without warning, as it always did, and the water came, not as a gentle rising, but a sudden force, a wall of salt and mud and unstoppable motion. swallowing the lowest carts first. Then the drivers, then the crates, as they cracked open and spilled coins into the surf, then the wagons themselves, which twisted and buckled as the sands beneath them liquefied, dragging them down into the deepening wash, while the horses thrashed and the soldiers screamed, and the treasure of an empire disappeared beneath the waves. John watched, helpless, silent. Perhaps for the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to lose something that could not be recovered. Not by decree, not by ransom, not by terror, because this was not a man stealing from men, but the earth taking back what had been ripped from it. In that moment, something shifted. The loss was not strategic, it was symbolic. The crown itself, England's power, history, and divine right was gone, not to fire or theft or rebellion, but to the mud, as if nature itself had pronounced judgment on a king who believed nothing could be taken from him. No bodyguard drowned, no general was blamed, no saboteur was needed, only time, water, and the weight of greed, and long after the tide had receded, there was nothing to recover. The treasure was buried, lost in salt and silt, never seen again. Even now, in the modern age, treasure hunters speak of it like a legend, but no coronet, no sceptre. No chalice has ever been found. It remains where it fell invisible, sunken and silent, much like the legacy of the man who lost it. For John, the physical toll came swiftly after. Already sick with fever, exhausted by weeks of flight, his body began to fail him. The dysentery came in waves, cramps that bent him double, heat in his blood that could not be cooled, and the gnawing ache in his belly that felt, some said, like justice finally pushing outward. His attendants tried to lift him, to carry him forward, but there was no forward left, only downward, toward Neverk Castle, toward death. And though history would record his final hours with gory fascination, the truth is that the true death of John's reign happened in that marsh. On that day, when the wagons sank and the kingdom seemed to look away. Because what is a king without a crown? What is a tyrant when his treasure has abandoned him? What is a man when even the land he rules will not let him pass? And though he would gasp and writhe for 2 more days, though he would speak, confess, tremble, and beg it was there, in the drowning silence of the wash, that his power ended. No coronation ever mattered more than that descent. No punishment more precise. No moment more fitting. And so the sea took what it was owed. And history did not object. He should have died there, in the mud, on the banks of the wash, where the tide took everything else from him, his gold, his jewels, his crowns and scepters and trappings of divine rule, but for reasons no chronicler could fully explain, his body refused to follow, and so began the final cruelty of his reign, a slow, ragged unravelling of flesh and will, as if death itself had decided that John of England did not deserve the mercy of silence, but instead would be dragged alive through the wreckage of everything he had built, forced to feel every second of what it meant to be unmade. His attendants, fearful but loyal, lifted his collapsing frame into a litter, for he could no longer ride a horse, no longer sit upright without retching, no longer hold down the fruit or meat or wine that had once been piled before him in excess his stomach, now a cauldron of rot, his skin pale and sticky with sweat, his lips cracked, his mouth filled with the taste of metal and bile, and as the litter lurched forward through the sodden countryside of East Anglia, it left behind more than tracks in the mud. It left a trail of filth and stench, so unbearable that even the guards covered their faces with cloth, not out of fear of contagion, but to escape the scent of their king dissolving from within. The fever never broke. It deepened. He mumbled to himself. He called out to people who weren't there. He clutched at the air as if it owed him something, barked orders to ghosts, and screamed curses at the Pope, the barons, the French, his own father, and more than once, at God, as though the heavens were simply another throne room that had dared to close its doors to him. The pain came in waves, folding him inward, until his spine curved like a question mark, and his fingers gripped the edges of the litter so tightly that his knuckles cracked. The dysentery had begun its final phase, not the visible kind, not the bloody torrent that tears through the body like a fire, but the quiet phase, the dry death, when the fluids are gone, the organs begin to fail, and the body begins to eat itself from the inside out. But still, he did not die. Not that night, nor the next, nor the one after that. And perhaps that was the greatest irony of all, that this king, who had stolen, extorted, poisoned, and betrayed, now found himself betrayed by the very body that had once housed all his cruelty. For now he was nothing more than a shell full of fever. And even as the rebellion surged and his enemies closed in, he was being carried like cargo toward the last stone refuge that would have him. Newark Castle, a lonely outpost in a kingdom that no longer acknowledged him. And yet, when they reached its gates on the evening of October 16th, the drawbridge still lowered, the torches still lit, the guards still bowed, for no matter how reviled he had become, the title still clung to him like smoke, King of England. And so they carried him inside. They laid him on a pallet of straw, and they waited. The chroniclers say he screamed in his sleep, that he tore at his own robes, that he babbled of fire and drowning and whispered the name of Arthur, the boy who had once stood between him and the crown, and who had disappeared in John's custody, never to be seen again. They say he wept, not for his kingdom, but for his son, 9 years old, too young to wear a crown, too innocent to be hated, and yet cursed to inherit everything John had broken. In rare moments of clarity, John dictated a will. He named his heir. He begged the church for forgiveness. He offered his body to God, though God had long since looked away, and still he lived. 2 full days passed, each hour a torment, each breath a mercy denied. Until at last, on the night of October 18th, in a chamber that smelled of mildew, sickness, and old smoke, with no queen at his side, no sons holding his hand, no priest offering comfort, only servants too afraid to speak, and guards too tired to care. John Lackland, king in name, tyrant in memory, villain in every legend that would follow, finally died. No bells were rung, no great mourning declared, only silence, relieved and rotting. And though chroniclers from every monastery in England recorded his passing, none did so with reverence, only with grim satisfaction, as if the death itself was not tragic, but necessary. Like a poisoned tree finally falling in a forest, it had long since blighted. Some wrote that his body burst, that his insides gave way entirely, that the filth he had poured upon England had turned on him at last, and forced its way back out, leaving behind not a man, but a lesson carved in rot. And though later kings would speak of reform, of justice, of sacred monarchy, none would ever again name a son John, not for more than 800 years, because that name no longer meant prince. It meant curse. When the news of King John's death began to ripple through the kingdom, carried not by royal decree, but by frightened messengers galloping through rain-slicked roads and wind-beaten fields, It did not inspire mourning or panic or even celebration, but instead something stranger, something heavier, something colder, a silence that settled across England like fog, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Unsure whether the death of its king meant the end of tyranny or the beginning of something far worse. Because John had not died with glory, he had not died with heirs gathered at his bedside. He had not died in a cathedral surrounded by holy men. He had died in filth, in pain, despised, and above all, he had died in the middle of a war. He had started and could not finish a war that had turned barons into rebels, the Pope into a protector, and England into a battlefield that no longer knew whose flag to follow. The French Prince Louis, already crowned in parts of London by barons who had lost all faith in their native king, now saw a crown within reach, and many feared that with John's death, the Plantagenet line had collapsed entirely, leaving the throne open to a foreign conqueror. But history, like war, is rarely linear, and sometimes salvation comes not on the back of a war horse, but in the fragile, untested hands of a child. His name was Henry. He was 9 years old. The son of the dead king, too young to have ruled. Too young? Some whispered. To even understand the weight of a crown. And yet in that moment when the kingdom flinched, when the barons froze, when the foreign armies crept closer to the gates, it was this boy whom fate placed at the center of everything. But a boy cannot rule alone. And this is where the story turns. Because while kings may fall and princes may vanish, sometimes it is the knight who endures. His name was William Marshall. He was more than 70 years old, a warrior of the old world, a man who had served 5 kings, fought in 2 crusades, and whose loyalty had once been mocked for its naivety, but now, as the kingdom trembled, he rose not as a soldier, but as a savior. He took the boy into his arms. He shielded him not only from blades and arrows, but from the judgment of a country that had grown tired of crowns. And then, in an act that would echo through centuries, he rode to Gloucester Cathedral, gathered what few loyal bishops remained, and performed a hasty coronation, pressing the crown of England onto the head of a boy who had not yet grown into his father's armor. There was no orchestra, no grand feast, no pageantry, only resolve, only urgency, and a message: the king is dead. Yes, but his son is not. And to the barons who had risen in fury, to the church that had withheld sacraments, and even to the French prince who now paced London's halls with ambition in his eyes, this coronation changed everything. Because this boy was innocent, he had not signed Magna Carta and then betrayed it. He had not taxed his people into ruin. He had not vanished his nephew or cursed his bishops or thrown women and children into dungeons. He was clean. And more than that, he was moldable. The barons saw in him an opportunity not to destroy the monarchy, but to remake it, to bind it not in fear or favor, but in law. And Marshall, the old knight who had seen too many kings die for pride, understood this better than anyone. And so, within weeks of John's death, Magna Carta was reissued. But this time, not as a humiliation forced on a tyrant, but as a promise made by a child, a charter stripped of its most inflammatory clauses, but one whose heart remained intact. The king is not above the law. Justice must be granted freely, and no man may be imprisoned without the judgment of his peers. And in this revised charter, the barons found what they truly needed: not revenge, not domination, but dignity. They had fought for these words. Now they were written by a regency that might actually honor them, and just like that, the cause began to crumble. The alliance with Louis, once born of desperation, now seemed unnecessary, even dangerous. Why serve a French prince when you could shape an English boy into a king of your own making within months? Barons who had once raised swords against the crown now lowered them. Castles once held in rebellion were surrendered. And Louis, who had tasted victory, now found himself bleeding allies and facing a kingdom that had decided, almost overnight, to heal. He retreated, and with him, the threat of foreign conquest faded. Not with fire, not with blood, but with the weight of a parchment, the steadiness of an old knight, and the fragile hope placed upon the shoulders of a child. And so it was that the death of the most reviled king in English history did not end the kingdom, but instead allowed it to survive. To pause, to flinch, and then to find a new rhythm. Not dictated by tyranny or bloodline, but by the idea, still radical even then, that law could bind power, and that even kings must answer to something higher than themselves. And that is why, even now, we remember this moment not as a coronation, but as a turning point, the day the kingdom flinched, but did not fall. There are kings whose legacies are carved into monuments, whose names echo through marble halls, sung in anthems, remembered in festivals, engraved on coins, painted in cathedrals, and gilded in the language of glory. And then there is John, whose legacy lies buried, not in gold or song, but in warning, in whispers, in the bones that rattle beneath the very foundations of monarchy, because though his death cleared the path for healing, and though his son would reign long and without scandal, the memory of his rule never truly vanished, it sank, like his treasure, like his crown, into the dark soil of England's collective mind, refusing to rot, refusing to be forgotten. For centuries after his death, John's name was invoked not as inspiration, but as a spectre. In sermons, he was held up as proof of divine punishment. In legal treatises, he was the cautionary tale, the tyrant who made Magna Carta necessary. In children's tales, he was reduced to the cowardly usurper who hunted Robin Hood, grovelling while his brother, the Lionheart, fought holy wars in the East. But beneath every simplification, beneath every caricature, the truth still lived. And that truth was more unsettling than any fiction, because John was not merely cruel, not merely paranoid, not merely weak. He was all of those things at once. And the very fact that a man so broken, so corrosive, so violently unfit for power, could rise to the highest seat in the land, forced England to look at itself, not with pride, but with shame. His reign was a mirror. It showed what happened when accountability vanished, when the law bent to fear, when religion became weapon, when justice was replaced with ransom, when truth drowned beneath the tide of ambition. He had turned the kingdom into a marketplace of pain, where loyalty was bought, mercy was rare, and punishment was a spectacle. He had taxed the breath of the living and the prayers of the dead. He had crushed the noble, defiled the holy, and held children hostage to control their fathers. And even when God silenced the church, even when the Pope cast him out, even when the very tide of England rose up to swallow his gold, he did not stop. Not until his body gave out, not until it was too late. And so, his story does not end with his death. It endures in every debate about power, in every charter signed in his shadow, in every ruler who fears being remembered as he was. Because John is not just a king who failed. He is the reason kings were forced to change. His failures etched the perimeter of monarchy. His cruelty forced England to choose between submission and rebellion, and it was that choice, born in resistance, that became the heart of something greater than any single reign. It became a contract between people and crown, between sword and law, between the future and the past, and that contract had a name: Magna Carta, signed in bitterness, revived in hope, and carried forward by every generation who looked back and asked, how did we ever let it go that far? But still, the ghost lingers. In every moment when a ruler forgets their limits, in every court where justice is delayed, in every chamber where law is twisted into loyalty, he is there, watching, not as king, but as echo, the bones beneath the crown, the poison in the lineage, the man who turned a kingdom into a cage, and in doing so, taught it how to escape. And perhaps that is the most damning truth of all, that England owes its liberty to its greatest tyrant, and that the blood shed under his rule became the ink of a freedom he would never have allowed. He ruled by fear. He died in filth. But what rose after him rose despite him. When the last spade of earth was thrown over his grave, and the torchlight dimmed within the chapel at Worcester, the world did not tremble, the sky did not darken, and the kingdom did not erupt in mourning. Because when John Lackland finally vanished beneath the stone floor of a church he had once robbed and defied, England did not lose a king, it lost a burden. And for the first time in nearly 2 decades, the nation could breathe without the weight of a crown pressed like a blade against its throat. But history is not a tale of endings. It is a slow unraveling of choices and consequences. And even as John's body decomposed beneath the altar, his shadow remained. Not in triumph, not in worship, but as a question written in ash. How do you rebuild a kingdom that burned from the inside out? The answer, as always, began not with kings, but with those left behind. Marshall stood. Henry knelt. The barons returned. The French retreated. And across a scarred and trembling land, something quiet but profound began to take root. Not celebration, not vengeance, but reconstruction. As if the people of England had seen what monarchy without restraint looked like, had endured the sickness of power unchecked, and now sought to shape something that could last beyond the whims of a single man. And so, Magna Carta, the document John had sealed in bitterness and voided in rage, was reborn. Not once, but again and again, with each revision refining the idea that a king is not a god. That law must stand above lineage, and that even the throne must answer to the governed. And though its original clauses spoke of fish traps and debt collection and baronial privilege, buried within its lines were seeds that would sprout into revolutions, parliaments, and constitutions in lands John never knew existed. It did not happen quickly, nor did it happen cleanly, but it happened. Because what began as a charter of complaint became a cornerstone of civilization. And long after John's name was reduced to a curse in fairy tales and sermons, his failure remained instructive. A reminder, etched into every crown that followed: never again. Never again would one man hold the church hostage and call it divine right. Never again would a monarch's words silence the courts. Never again would the kingdom turn to ash, in the name of one man's fear. And perhaps that is the bitter miracle of it all, that the king who poisoned the very idea of kingship would become the reason the crown was forced to evolve, not through vision, but through revulsion, not by rising, but by falling so violently, so completely, that the world could no longer pretend it was invincible. Because John did not just fail. He failed so spectacularly, so visibly, and so unforgivably, that he became the example that could never be repeated. The boundary line drawn in blood, and sickness, and law. The skeleton beneath the golden robes, forever whispering to those who wore them, "Remember me," And remember what happens when you forget the people you rule. So the kingdom that rose after him was not built on glory. It was built on memory. And in that memory, England found something stronger than loyalty accountability. The boy king Henry III would reign longer than any king before him. Parliaments would rise. Laws would be rewritten, and across oceans, centuries later, in courtrooms and colonies and declarations of freedom, men would point back to that meadow called Runnymede, to that cursed seal, to that failed king, and say, here, this is where the idea began. The idea that power must serve. That rule must answer. That the crown, no matter how heavy, must be worn with humility. John never understood that. But in not understanding it, he gave it to the world. And though his tomb lies in stone and silence, his legacy lives on, not as greatness remembered, but as catastrophe transformed a fire that scorched so deeply, it cleared the way for something new to grow. A kingdom reborn in ash, and a name never spoken again.